Welcome to the Success Times Happiness podcast, a platform dedicated to engaging discussions with inspiring individuals aimed at nurturing personal development. I'm Richard Thompson, your host, a father, entrepreneur, world champion Ultraman, and passionate about all things high performance. Our mission is to empower both ourselves and you to unlocking our fullest potential, recognizing that this life is no dress rehearsal. While I may not have all the answers, this show serves as our collective journey to uncover them. Today, we sit down with Kathleen Hope, a passionate advocate and the CEO of Sunny Kids, a unique charity committed to breaking the cycle of domestic and family violence. Kathleen has dedicated her career to creating systematic change, supporting vulnerable families, and ensuring that children impacted by early life adversity have the chance to rewrite their stories. Her unwavering dedication to this challenging yet vital work is both inspiring and deeply impactful, making her a beacon of hope for countless families. Expect to learn how Sunny Kids uses early intervention and emotional intelligence to help children and families overcome trauma and build resilience, the societal and generational factors that perpetuate domestic violence and how they can be addressed, and practical tips for having conversations about domestic violence and supporting victims in a compassionate and effective way. This conversation was impactful, and I really appreciate Kathleen's time on the show. All right, let's get into it. Kathleen Hope, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thanks for having me.
I saw a recent study, and no doubt in your role, you're seeing lots of data from universities or from different sources, but I saw one that was that from 2022 to 2023, there was a 30% increase year on year from domestic violence causing death to intimate spouses or by intimate spouses. In this day and age, where education is so prevalent and easily accessible, or much easier to access and share, why is it that cases of DV and domestic violence generally, is it more prevalent in society?
That's such a big question. And there's so many elements that come into play when we're looking at increase in stats. It could be really easy to say that what we're seeing is more people reporting. But the truth is we're seeing an increase in the lethality of domestic violence cases in this country. And we've had a huge increase. That stat is actually correct. And we've had a huge increase in women in particular and children who have been murdered as a result of domestic and family violence. It used to be approximately one a week, and I believe we've had 96 deaths in the last year. And that's an incredibly heartbreaking number. So when we're reaching almost 2 deaths a week, you would think that the world would stop, at least Australia, and pay attention to this. But there are so many elements of DV that is now recognised and people are educated about that don't include physical violence. We also know that it's human nature to start seeking control in our surroundings when we're faced with life stresses that increase. There is a huge difference between very unhealthy behaviours and abusive behaviours. Although, when you display unhealthy behaviours as a result of generational learnings, life stresses that are becoming too much, and you receive a reward for that, the slip into abusive behaviours is a very, very slippery slope. And we see people who you would have never imagined being that controlling and that domineering actually behave that way in private with their partners, those who are closest to them.
When you say reward, what do you mean?
It's an intrinsic reward. It's an empowerment that people can receive from being in control.
Consciously or subconsciously,
Absolutely,
I'd imagine.
yeah. And when you receive that reward unconsciously and then you recognise where that's come from, the choice to be abusive and be controlling is that slip straight into toxic and abusive behaviour.
Talk to me then about, as we talk about death, let's say, or murder in those extreme horrific scenarios, but domestic violence now, and certainly with the changes of the law that's just come in, are a number of different categories, right? Not just physical violence.
Correct. And those categories have been around for a long time. For example, coercive control, I mean, that term was coined back in the 70s. You know, this is, as far as the sector is concerned, the domestic violence and human services sector, we've been aware of the pattern of behaviour that we now identify as coercive control for a long time. It's been our bread and butter, really. It became obviously top of mind and very public after the horrific murder of Hannah Clark and her children. And people have a better understanding of it now, but it really is a longitudinal pattern of behaviour to intentionally control and coerce somebody to behave in a way that you find acceptable. That's coloured by your economic station. It's coloured by your religious beliefs. It's coloured by how you've been raised and what expectations you have in your intimate partner relationship. All of those things in a healthy relationship still exist, but the power imbalance doesn't exist. And when someone feels like they can't challenge you, or it's too difficult to challenge you, or I need to walk on eggshells because it's not worth that, that's where that reward seeps in.
Yeah.
And that becomes the new benchmark.
Yeah, right. And there's a study, or there's a book about World War II there where these policemen, ordinarily upstanding people of society, and within only a few months they became the head of the Nazi war camps, the prisoner of war camps. And it's almost like in that book, it seemed to be that it was sort of malevolence or evil by 1,000 decisions. So it wasn't as if one day you wake up, and putting it in this situation, it's not as if one day you wake up and you are the perpetrator in domestic violence situation, but it is incremental. And it may be, is it not the case that it may be, and this is certainly not to condone it, but it's childhood from them.
Nobody likes to hear this, but that is our catch cry. It all begins in childhood, no matter what. Now, there are those exceptional cases where narcissism, and I know that word is thrown around a lot, but those narcissistic personality disorders that are in our community that we're not really aware of until we're affected by it, that's a whole different case. So if we can put them into a different category and we look at the general population, the majority of people, it is that. It's incremental, absolutely. And we know that DV is a choice, and we talk about violence being a choice often, and we know that it's a choice because it doesn't happen on the first date. You wouldn't tolerate it, right?
Yes.
Social constructs prevent us from allowing this kind of behaviour. But throughout history, we've seen experiments like the Stanford Prison Experiment and a number of other experiments that have become public that really demonstrate the primal human behaviours that come out when they're empowered with authority and power. And all of those sayings that hold a little bit of weight, but we throw them around like, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It takes an incredible amount of intrinsic emotional intelligence to resist the urge to take something from somebody else in order to empower yourself. And that's human nature. So we don't look at these people and go, you're a monster and you started as one. It absolutely is something that is generational. It comes from childhood. It comes from society. There are very deeply rooted economical, political, and social constructs that contribute to violence against women. It is a gendered issue, and we see that play out in the social hierarchy system that is patriarchy. But there's all these buzzwords that I think people really struggle to understand. How does it all play a part? It's so multifaceted that it's really impossible to compartmentalise in a simple conversation. But essentially, if you look at every element in today's world, just as we're sitting here now, what we see on the TV, what we're exposed to on social media, what we're talking about now, violence is really normalised. And instead of saying no to violence, what we're doing is we're looking at that violence was worse than this one. So we're going to focus on that one. And we start to triage the same behaviour, but with different levels of urgency. And so we accept it. And, I myself am very accepting of some forms of violence over others, and this is my world. And so it's really difficult for the general population to understand why this happens.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And the narcissists aside, because they're purposely, I guess, not doing their best, I guess.
It's ego-driven for narcissists.
But for the general population outside of that barrier, no matter how someone is acting, the presumption is that they're doing their best in terms of the instruction sheet that they know how to deal with the situation. And that may not be socially or legally acceptable.
And sometimes people are not doing their best, but they're saying that they are. And some people will play the victim and will use the excuse that because of what I've been through, this is all I know.
Do you find that as an example on both sides, both the perpetrator and the victim? Because I can imagine it's such a
it would be such a delicate, and I find it very challenging to empathize or put myself in that position but I don't know whether I'm challenged or whether I can scarily see, or it's, for me, I can understand why someone would stay in an environment because it is incremental and there's not one thing that will break up until it is, that breaks the camel's back. But is it the victim mentality where for the victims there that don't speak out, that don't act?
There can be for some. It can also be that is all they know of a relationship, so they're really accepting of that behaviour no matter what it actually does to them. There are a lot of people experiencing DV right now as we speak that would never name it as that wouldn't have any idea that that's what they're experiencing because it is intergenerational for a lot of people. It's also incredibly difficult to sever a relationship with someone that you love. And, this person that you're involved with, they have elements of them that are amazing, and that's what you fell in love with. When you are in a situation where you've experienced the explosion and then all of the remorse comes, and a very real, often, intention to, I'm going to get better. I'm going to get therapy. We're not going to do this again. I don't want to make you feel that way. That's not all cases. The other cases are the ones where it's, you made me do this. If you behaved properly, I wouldn't have. That's another story, but we're talking about those unhealthy behaviours that can be abusive, but that's not the intention. So when you're faced with somebody that you absolutely love and you share your life with, and they're saying to you, I don't want to treat you that way. I don't know what's going on with me. I'm too stressed. I need counselling and everything else. And you believe them because they believe it themselves. But unless those tangible steps are actually taken to change their behaviour pattern and interrupt that pattern of behaviour, there's no accountability for that person, and that intrinsic reward comes next time they explode. Why should they regulate when you're there to be their punching bag, virtually or otherwise?
And so talk to me about Sunny Kids then.
Sunny Kids is such a unique charity. And we talk about domestic violence being a gendered issue because it is, and we can't deny that. But for us as a service, we recognise that a significant portion of the work we do lies with children, because we're looking at victim survivors who have lived horrendous experiences, some worse than others. And there's a whole lot of trauma and work that needs to be done to help them work through everything that they've experienced. But while they're working on themselves, who is repairing the early life adversity and the impacts of that on children? Who's rewriting the script for them so this doesn't become normal behaviour for them? So that breaking the cycle, another buzzword, breaking the cycle is our sole focus. So therein lies the challenge for us as practitioners, where we're sitting with somebody who is a victim of horrendous abuse, and then we're asking them to be accountable for all of the decisions that affect their children. So we're saying, you are a victim in your own right, and that's horrible and that shouldn't have happened. But now we need you to put that aside and focus on what's going on for your kids.
For the future.
Exactly. So it's a really unique client-centered model that we have where we work on both, but we are unapologetically focusing on children becoming adults who do not perpetrate abuse, who understand their responsibility in community and in society, and learn ways to regulate and build their own emotional intelligence, repair interruptions to development. And that's a huge factor that we see impacting adults now who are choosing violence.
And what role does the lived experience for the child play in that repair work with the child?
Well, every child is so different. So it's going to depend on what's going on for them. But again, a lot of this behaviour is normalised. So to give you an example, many, many years ago, I remember this one woman that I was working with in the refuge space, and her language with her children was horrendous. She would call them little C's, and, it was really normalised language for her. And I heard her do it one day, and I pulled her aside, and we had a really great rapport. I was her caseworker at the time, and I said, look, and I don't know if you realise the impact this is having on the kids. It's really offensive language, and if other people hear this, they're going to judge you for that. So it's really getting down to those bare basic things that you would think everybody in society knows is not acceptable. And she was genuinely shocked. Wow. This was language that her mum used with her. It was completely normalised in the region that she had come from when she relocated and came to us. Her learning that this wasn't okay behaviour was just the first step. The rest of it was every time that behaviour happened, us interrupting that intentionally. And we continued to do that. So we had an agreement in place and we had a code word. And if I'd hear her in the common area or in the park with the kids, I'd hear her use the language and I'd call out the code word and she would stop and she'd redirect. So it was really basic, almost primitive behaviour change. And one day I did it and it was just one time too many and she broke down. And she goes, I don't know what to do. I go, what am I supposed to do? They don't listen to me. How do I get them to listen? That's what worked with me. And that fear-based parenting is what we were all raised with, right? I don't know about you, but I was raised in the 80s. That's fear-based parenting at its best, right? So we've got generations of parents right now who are trying to do a great job at parenting, but we've got two different arms. Those who are physical discipline is the way that we make our kids comply, and the other arm that is, I don't want to do what was done to me, so I'm going to try something different, but they're seeing that it's not as effective. Immediate behaviour change comes from that physical discipline, so there's the reward for adults. All it does, though, is add to another childhood issue that can be played out in adulthood.
Within Sunny Kids, how do you encourage, if there's so many people out there that are I guess, victims and passive victims or just sitting in it, right? How are you encouraging? Because when you tell that story, I sort of think, well, that's wonderful in the sense that that mother was, I guess, aware enough or had the self-value enough, had a high enough self-value to say, yes, I need to change. I'm able to change, right? I've done this. My mom did it. I'm doing it. But you're here, Kathleen, and I believe I can change. I'm sure there's a lot of people, both male and female, who go, well, that's just me, right? That I can't change. That's just who I am. But then there's obviously a lot of other people who have growth mindset to go, I can develop and become, the potential of what I can be is much greater than what I am now. So in saying all of that, how are you guys encouraging or providing the agency to the victims out there to come forward to obtain help?
We look for every opportunity to do that. So it's something that Sunny Kids, I believe, does really well is engaging the community. So, with our P100 Club, with the business community, with donors, supporters, even our government contractors, every opportunity we've got, we provide education and information. That's just one element. The other element is that our engagement with schools is twofold. So we're not just working with the families that the schools are referring to us who need support, and that's the same work we do in the refuge, but we're doing it with families in the community. And over 90% of those cases have DV as a presenting. It's really, really common, and that always surprises people. So we look for all of these elements, and every single one of our programs actually intersect, and sometimes we move families between programs. But at the core of it, from a practice perspective, is emotional intelligence. And those 4 quadrants of EQ, right at the very heart of that, the very first quadrant you need to focus on is an accurate self-assessment. And you can't have an accurate self-assessment if you're only reflecting yourself. You actually have to receive support and consultation from those around you. A lot of people don't get true feedback from people in their life. And if they did, then we move into that challenge of beliefs versus values. And if it is incongruent with a belief that they hold, they feel that cognitive dissonance and they choose to distance themselves from that truth. So we focus very heavily on EQ to keep it simple, very heavily on EQ and that accurate self-assessment. And we do that by empowering them to be accountable. That requires rapport. So sometimes what I've said before is, we're really not doing our job properly if we don't piss off our client.
To challenge
We've got to
them.
be honest.
To challenge it.
Yeah. We're all human beings. So understanding human behaviour is at the forefront. Focusing on the development of EQ is at the heart.
I said it at the start of the show in the introduction, how incredibly impressive Sunny Kids is as a charity and the amount of work that you guys do to the victims that come to you. How can we progress to a stage in the community or in society where it is it's a diminishing rate of occurrence?
It is achievable. I don't think it's achievable in my lifetime. It's achievable only after it becomes much more critical than it is now. And that's probably one of the hardest things, I think, for practitioners in our service, where it can feel like it's a Band-Aid approach. So we've done this amazing thing for this family and we've interrupted that trauma and we've set them on a new path.
But the root cause out there is still there,
The
right?
social construct is that needs to change first, and if I could give you examples of in history when that has occurred. It wasn't that long ago when it was acceptable and in fact legal for rape to occur in marriages. And it wasn't until the late 60s, right, when that was outlawed. The Marriage Act, was that 68, 69 or whatever it was? Yeah, so until that point, it was completely acceptable for that to occur. Social change has to happen before legislative change happens. Prior to that, it was completely acceptable for a man in his 30s or 40s to marry a 12, 13-year-old girl. Social change occurred first. And what that requires is two people with common goals and mutual respect. And when common goals and mutual respect occur, and then that becomes the new narrative in their community. And it might just be 2 or 3 people, but it starts to spread. Now, that takes time. That's generational change we're talking about here. But we can't fix this overnight. And there are so many wonderful initiatives out there and so many wonderful services, but the truth is we are still reacting to an existing issue that is thousands of years old. And until all of those social constructs change, legislation can't keep up. We've got a big job on our hands. And the first step, from my perspective, is gender parity to start with. When that occurs, then we're going to see a shift in our system that allows this kind of abuse to occur.
How important is it in the education? Sunny Kids focusing on the children's, on the victims' children in that scenario. Do you see value in that general education piece within a school curriculum?
This is always an interesting topic, so I'm glad you asked, because ordinarily early intervention is so effective because what happens is you create a narrative, you deliver that narrative to the masses. And that becomes the general social construct that generation will abide by. You'll have your outliers, always do, no matter what the topic is. That doesn't work for domestic violence. And the reason it doesn't work is because so much of it is happening at home and it's not known. So that harm occurs before they're even in an educational institution.
Right.
Plus, we've got harm to development and attachment that is occurring in utero. 2 of the most dangerous times for a woman for violence is when she's pregnant or when she leaves the relationship. So we've literally got stress, which we all know in the medical field would support, that is one of the worst things for a pregnant woman is to feel stressed.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most dangerous times for her. So that impact of attachment, that hypervigilance, and then we move through every other developmental lifespan theory, and we don't have a week to go through all of that here today. All of those elements play a part in why early intervention through education doesn't work. So I think information needs to be provided right at the moment that somebody identifies that they're pregnant. That's about parenting and development. Relationship-wise, though, we have to consistently do this for the next 30 years. Every student that goes through primary school. A
generation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's the only way that it's going to work, but the system has to catch up to.
Okay. I'm going to pivot then because I'm feeling, and I'm not even in it, but I'm feeling a weight of expectation, of responsibility, I guess, untapped. It's almost like you got a job that is unachievable in front of you. That pressure or that weight that you're dealing with, that the topic is so critically important, and the weight of the expectation of not of the charity, but also just of the general topic of domestic violence, it almost feels unattainable. Coupled with the cases that come through your door and the facts that on a micro level, as horrific as they are, you're dealing with that every day. You're seeing what someone can do to another human. How do you manage that personally?
Personally, I mean, look, I have probably had a little bit of a social justice fire from the moment I could talk. I remember being 6 years old and I remember watching Bob Hawke on TV at a football game and he said something misogynistic. That was kind of his thing back then. It was something that was a bit sexist towards women. And I remember at 6 years old mouthing off in the lounge room about what I'd just heard, and I was so outraged. I think I was born with it. I genuinely do think I was born with it. And, there are so many elements to the work that we do it's terrifying, particularly when we are doing work with perpetrators or if we're helping a woman flee or, we've taken some risks that I won't name, but we probably shouldn't have taken. And there is fear attached to that. There was a time when my personal home had to be locked down and police had to do welfare checks. There was a high-profile case. They had word through the Australian Federal Police that our refuge had been located and that some of our staff's homes had been located. So, I was quite terrified about that. That was not a fun position to be in. But the only way I can describe it is that my indignation is greater than my fear, and I have such a fire to fight for what is right. And that sounds really altruistic, but I accept that nobody is perfect. And we all absolutely have an opportunity to do our best, but some people are choosing not to. I also strongly believe that everybody has capacity to change. And there's a lot of people that we work with. I worked with a dad who was incarcerated twice for physically abusing 2 women, landing them in hospital. His son had attempted suicide. He was incredibly entitled, screaming at me, in fact, in a public place, demanding that I help him get access to his newborn daughter from a new ex-partner. And my response to him was that there's no way I'm going to help him until he becomes somebody that she deserves to have in her life. And that moment where I challenged him, he had kind of this mocking grin to his face. He's like, okay, I'm curious. Let's, and he calmed down and we started having conversation. I was terrified of his behaviour. But I was so angry at his entitlement that he thought that he could actually be a part of this little girl's life, behaving the way that he was. So calling him out on that, we worked with him on and off, a number of different caseworkers did, for about 4.5 years. He was somebody who had every reason in the world to hate the world. He'd experienced horrendous sexual assault as a child. He had been thrown from bad partner to bad partner from his mother. There was a lot of reasons why he was entitled to be angry at the world and why he was entitled to behave angry. But what he didn't recognise until he started working with us was that his trauma doesn't need to be somebody else's and that he can deal with that without projecting that. And that took a huge shift, and him getting off drugs and him getting off alcohol and him choosing to be somebody that his children actually deserve. That became the focus. So if we turned up and he was off the rails, we'd go, okay, well, we're not going to catch up today. Let us know when you're sober. And that took a lot of dedication and a lot of commitment and a lot of work. But we saw the progress over time. And it really did just come down to accountability. To answer your question as directly as I can, how do we cope with it? We are not invested in the outcome that somebody else chooses. We're just invested in the opportunity to get them to see a different way of living. And our outputs are what we measure, not outcomes. So if we do everything that we can to hold them accountable, support them to change, lift people up, support children to be healed, then we can feel really comfortable with that. That doesn't mean sometimes we don't spend our evenings in tears or upset. We do a lot of supervision, a lot of debriefing, but I just think we've got to be a little bit crazy to do this work.
So take me back. You're 6 and yelling at the TV, and then what happens to your upbringing?
Look, I think my family were fairly used to that. That was pretty much the ongoing nature of my relationship in the family. I was always the person who was on my soapbox about something, or I always had an issue. I would always challenge authority. I always challenged teachers. They never knew as much as I did. I was very arrogant as a child. Confident. No, you know what? It wasn't even confidence. It was indignation. It was stubbornness, absolutely stubbornness, and just a refusal to believe that what I've been given is all I'm allowed to accept. And that just means globally. And so I don't know where that came from, but I would say that I fostered that as I grew. And it took a while for me to learn that I didn't need to shout it from the rooftops. I could actually take that indignation and use it to change something. Yeah.
And then through school, had the same.
Oh my gosh, I must have driven my teachers crazy. Look, we moved around a lot when I was younger, so I went to a lot of different schools.
Okay.
In 1 year, I went to 9 different schools in the 1 year.
Wow. What was the result of that?
Well, my parents were distributors, and we had different businesses, and they also had itchy feet. So I had very, very young parents. They had me when they were very, very young, and I was one of 4. So they moved around a lot, and they grew up with us. So it was a bit of a unique childhood in that sense. And so I didn't really have that sense of community. So I looked at our whole society as a nation as my community.
Right.
So I got all of my information from the news. I got all of my information from education, and I challenged everything, So I had a platform already by the time I was 16. I went, okay, you know what? I'm going to move out of home. I'm going to start doing something. And I didn't know what it was going to be, but my intention was to start studying psychology and start studying law. So I actually worked towards a law degree at Bond University. And I gave all of that up. Found a partner. My life went down a slightly different road. I was more interested in having fun, socialising and all the rest of it. But I never lost that fire. I never lost that indignation. So I started going through different roles in life. Some work with local government up at Noosa Council, and then had my first child. And from that moment, it was a real eye-opener to go, not only am I terrified about the state of the world, but I now have this human being that I'm completely responsible for. And so that just really changed my whole worldview again. And I went, I want her life to be worthy, pleasant, comfortable, and without harm. And I knew I couldn't achieve that. So I had to start from grassroots and just start working towards what I was actually working in a electrical engineering firm. And I said to my boss, I'm quitting, I'm going back to study. And I quit that day.
This is after you had your first.
Yeah.
Yeah. And at what point do you think Sunny Kids and starting in the whole environment of domestic violence?
Well, DV wasn't actually what I was going to choose. Child protection was my passion. So I had started studying, and our course coordinator actually called me. I was going to do my placement at Child Safety right here in Maroochydore. And he called me and he said he knew my predecessor, previous CEO of Sunny Kids, and they'd been chatting on the weekend, just gone, and they were looking for some students to participate in an action research project that they were just about to roll out in the refuge. And asked if I'd be interested. And I said, oh, look, I'm not sure if DV is where I want to go. Like I felt I'd be too emotional for that work.
As against child protection?
Yeah, well, again, indignation versus compassion.
Fair play.
Yeah, so, but I agreed to do that. And I think partly, and if he ever listens to this, he'll know what I mean. Eric, shout out to you, because I think it was partly obligation to him that I felt, that I was like, okay, let's do this. And I started in the refuge, and no disrespect to the service at all, but the immediate thing I noticed was a very old school welfare mentality. And it was some staff, not all, there was some beautiful staff there, but some staff who, I don't know if they were burnt out or if they were power tripping because of the position they hold.
Right.
But I saw clients who were vulnerable and abused and still full of fire, fighting back against that. And I just went, wow, these are actually my people. These are people who are fighting against the oppression they've experienced. And I fell in love with it from the beginning. So it all just started with a placement.
Yeah, okay. And why, was it because of the birth of your first child that you were focused on child protection and, I guess, family protection?
Oh, look, I've always had, I don't know how to conceptualize this actually. I see children as our most vulnerable in community, right? I can't find the words to describe that. They have adults making decisions for them, and yet they are expected to be resilient, expected to deal with whatever's thrown at them. They are destabilized continuously, and we have a social system that allows parents to have so much power and make decisions because they're their parents, but we don't own our children. So again, I have a bit of indignation about that. Actually, I'll share this with you because I started at school, kindergarten it was, in New South Wales, and I remember this clearly. And the principal, who was friends with my parents, so my grandparents, and he had the school cane in a box behind his desk, and he would bring every student in when they first started school, and he would tell them in kindergarten. So kindergarten was like prep in New South Wales.
Yeah.
And he'd bring every student in.
So you must be 5 or 6.
Yeah. And he would tell them about the cane, and it had just been outlawed in New South Wales at the time, just before I started kindy. And he would tell them all and showed them how he used to be able to belt children, so they better behave. Well, I yelled at him and told him, "You're not allowed to hit me. The only people that are allowed to hit me are my parents." That, like, I was just so indignant about it. And I was just thought, you don't have the right to do that. So I always had this kind of,
Yeah.
and it's not fair that this strange man that I don't know and have no relationship with is telling me that he's allowed to put his hands on me. That is completely unacceptable. So I don't know what legacy I've carried throughout previous lives or anything else, but I had that belief system.
Yeah, right.
So children, to me, I feel it is the responsibility of the entire community to protect our children.
Mm.
We don't get to be bystanders when it comes to kids. So I feel really passionate about that. And I know a lot of people have that belief system of not paying attention to what's happening next door and not getting involved. And I say, stuff that, get involved.
Mm.
Say what you need to, report if you have to, do anything other than be a bystander, because these children will become adults who will do the same damn thing.
Mm. And I was going to say is that the people listening, when you say people are in environments where they may not be able to identify it as domestic violence, but probably more likely is that they'll be able to see it in others.
Absolutely.
And so how is it that we can have a conversation peer to peer or friend to friend to say, you know what, whether it's you're talking to the perpetrator or whether you're talking to the victim, but how do you have such a delicate conversation when maybe the person consciously or subconsciously knows that it's not great?
Actually, I can give you a couple of really simple tips. This is a common question because it can be really hard for people to have that awkward conversation, but there's some really simple ways to start it. And it depends on your relationship with the person. If you don't have a strong relationship or it's a work colleague that you don't really connect with, but you're concerned, start by intentionally sharing a story about something you've heard and then gauge their reaction to that story. Wait for an opening. That's how you start with someone you don't have a relationship with. Someone you do have a relationship with, somebody that you care about, just letting them know, look, I am a bit worried about you. I just want you to know if you ever want to talk to me, I'm here. Open questions when it comes to domestic violence. You know, for anyone who's ever done training around suicide, we know asking direct questions is the preferred method. With domestic violence, you don't want to ask a direct question. You want to actually leave an open question on the table, give them an opportunity. But if you use I statements like, I'm just a bit worried about you, just a bit worried about a few things I heard, or I watched what happened at the barbecue the other weekend and that concerned me a bit. Are you okay? I just want to check in. That's all it takes. All you're doing is letting them know that when they're ready, they can come and talk to you. And that's enough. All people need is that door to be opened.
What role does the media have in assisting the domestic violence issue in the country? And I guess on top of that, how does a movie or a book like It Starts With Us or It Ends With Us, I don't know which one it was,
Ends With Us.
have to opening the conversation? Or does it dramatize it?
I think media's improved a lot in how they're reporting, but they're still missing the mark and it's not their fault. They don't understand what it really looks like. And if I can tentatively bring politics into that as well, we have seen media improve in the way they're reporting, the language they're using. We saw the police commissioner at the time after the murder of Hannah Clark get up on TV. I saw his statement when he said this was a father who was pushed too far. I watched that happen and I said he won't be in that position by the end of the day. And sure enough, he wasn't. The language has started to shift, which is great because that is that narrative that gets out to the masses. But the message is still incorrect. The idea that a lot of people have in their head of a domestic violence victim, particularly children, is that meek, mild, scared, cowering in the corner, that kind of behaviour. But it's not. It's the little Johnny who is throwing stuff off the shelves in the supermarket, swearing at mum, pushing trolleys into cars, throwing desks in the classroom, all of the antisocial behaviour that leads to another topic, which is youth justice. And this is what we're seeing government place a huge focus on right now. We know the cause. We know why these kids are behaving the way they are. They have been let down by the system and society at every turn. They know it's antisocial. They can't regulate anymore, and they're choosing not to. They don't need to manage impulse control because they've got nobody to aspire to. They've got nobody to emulate. There are so many elements involved. Now, of course, you've got your small cohort that will just do what they do because that is what they've chosen in life. But in general, the majority of them, are children who have not had what they needed to develop and become contributing members of society. And we look at the antisocial behaviour and we say, what do we do about that? They're too far gone. All they need now is punitive discipline. It doesn't work. It does protect the community. Of course it does. It takes the burden away from the community and it puts them in a place where they're not seen and they're not heard. But it doesn't actually do anything to solve the problem.
If you had a magic wand, right, what would you do?
I'd put Sunny Kids in every single home in the country to start with, work with every family in the country. If I had a magic wand, I don't think there's one element that I could change that would have a direct impact now other than eradicating violence. But I don't think that society would look the way it did if all violence was gone. It's an interesting topic because, there are things that I hear about in the course of my work and just in life in general, and I think, well, that person doesn't deserve to live. And so I think about those exceptions to a general rule that I even hold and what my values are, and they're contradicted all the time.
Because all violence is bad.
And I focus very, very heavily on trying to have congruence between my values and my practice. And when I face those kind of challenges, I can imagine everybody else does as well. So magic wands, I don't think really work. I think it just takes a hell of a lot of hard work and commitment. And this, keeping it top of mind, keep talking about it. Don't let the topic drop off. Don't let society become comfortable with the behaviour. Keep calling it out until it changes.
Oh, Kathleen, I could talk to you for hours. This has been really special, and I thank you for your time. And it sounds like as you've grown up, you've had this really strong moral compass as to what's right and what's wrong, and which is really, really lovely. What is the process for you when your values get questioned?
I'll feel an immediate trigger, which is that physical feeling, the heat rushing up, and the first thing that I want to do is educate, but with force. So learning to not do that has been primary for me. Look, I see a trigger now as my red flag to go, where did that come from? We've all experienced different traumas in our life or different experiences that we wish we'd handled differently or wish somebody had done something different for us. I've had a number of health issues through my life. I've had accidents. In fact, I've been clinically dead twice. There's been so many reasons why I shouldn't be here on this earth. I'm not at all religious, although I was raised Catholic. But there is a reason that I'm here. So long as I continue to do what I'm doing.
Can we talk about how you've been clinically dead twice?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, one of them was most recent when I had my daughter, and it was actually during an emergency cesarean, and they lost her heartbeat and they lost mine. So it was a big traumatic event. But
was this for your first?
This was for my first, yeah. And but I wasn't supposed to be able to have children as a result of an accident that I had when I was quite young. And that was in a car accident where one of those old Chargers, the cars, the Charger, had rolled boot to bonnet, and I had flown out of the windshield and I was folded in half, back to front. So the back of my heels were at the back of my head and the car landed on top of me. So my dad and a truck driver who happened to see the accident had lifted the car off me, and by the time paramedics got there, they were able to get me into hospital, bring me back, I was in traction for about 6 weeks or longer, and there's a whole lot of development that changed. I was 18 months old when the accident occurred, but the recovery took a few years, because they had put me in traction wrong. So one of my legs stopped growing at a really fundamental growth period for a child. So I have a significant difference in the length of my legs that I compensate for when I walk. So sometimes it looks like I'm limping, but I'm not. And as a result of that, I have a bent spine as well. But what occurred was basically my entire reproductive area was squashed. So there was an assumption that I was never going to be able to have children. And every year after that accident, until I was a teenager, my mum would have to take me back to Sydney Hospital so that they could do their checks and all the rest of it. And I have this scar that I hide quite well that goes up into the back of my head where I was almost scalped by the windshield of the car.
Who was driving?
And my mum was driving, and my mum was driving. My dad was in the passenger seat, and they're going to kill me for sharing this, but they had a baby bottle that had old milk in it, or formula. So Dad had tipped it out the window, and it went in to the back window, and someone in the back screamed. Mum turned around to look at what was going on and missed a turn.
And all the other passengers?
Everybody else was okay. My mum was stuck in the car, and the roof of the car had embedded into her skull, so they had to remove her. But she was quite hysterical for obvious reasons, so they had to take us in separate ambulances because she wouldn't let them treat her while she was focused on me.
Wow. Has that experience, and presumably you don't remember?
I don't remember the accident. I do remember, obviously, the repeated trips to hospital and having to wear a built-up shoe and then refusing to do that.
But do you think that that's played a part in your outlook and independence?
Oh, look, potentially. I mean, I definitely don't feel unlucky. I actually feel very lucky, actually. And I'm kind of waiting. There was just a couple of years. I will share this with you. There's very few people that know this, but just a couple of years ago, after a VIP event for one of our events, I went home and was not in a good space. My head felt like a basketball was being blown up with an air pump. And so my partner rushed me to the hospital.
Physically or?
Physically.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And so it turns out I had a blood clot on the brain. So anyway, went into hospital. They did all their magic work. I ended up being released, called our board president, let her know, and I said, look, don't worry about it though, I'm going to be fine, and I just need a couple of days. But unfortunately, I contracted COVID from the hospital, so I was already pretty under the weather, and then COVID as well, so it completely knocked me, and I ended up being bedridden just for a number of weeks, could barely move, couldn't think, couldn't function. But it had a huge impact on my memory, and that's probably the first experience I've had with all of those health issues where I started to be a bit concerned because my memory's always been my greatest strength. So impacting my memory like that, not knowing if it was because of the blood clot or if it was because of COVID, and trying to get back in the swing of things, knowing a lot of people rely on me and we had big important things to focus on. But what I learned about myself during that process was that I most definitely connect being busy with being productive. And so if I'm not busy, I don't feel productive. And if I don't feel productive, it impacts my mental health.
And so how have you grown since then?
It's still an ongoing challenge. I intentionally took some time off just this year, actually, just to test that with nothing planned, just to give myself a go. And I hated every moment of it. So, I've still got a bit of work to do there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the productivity is important, but separating the busyness feeling is the key there.
Yeah. Just recognising worth in taking a break as well.
Easier said than done.
Well, because I preach it to everybody else, but don't practice it myself, right? It's typical.
Well, I thank you for the work that you do and your team.
Thank you.
Because, as I said, even just sitting in it today, I felt the overwhelming weight of the job, let alone the micromanaged, different cases individually, but which are horrific in detail, but just the overwhelming duty that you have and responsibility you have as a charity and as a place in society is not nothing, and it's everything. And I've been recommended by a number of people to sit down with you, and I can see why, because you are a force to be reckoned with.
Oh, thank you so much. I so appreciate that. Honestly, we have an incredible team of people, but it can be really hard to hear that because to us it feels like this is what we should be doing, and it feels like it's the bare minimum. There's so much more we want to do. And in fact, if we didn't have all of the rules and legislation, there would be so many more risks that we would take to put a stop to this. They're in place for a reason and we abide by them, don't worry. But it's really hard to self-promote about the work that you do when you feel like the work that you do is foundational. Yeah. So, hearing that kind of feedback, it's really lovely. And I think one of the things we are trying to work on even as a team is recognising and celebrating the impact that we're having rather than the obligation.
Yeah, I understand that. That's very much a high performance mindset of why should we celebrate when we're not yet there? But it's important too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, critical. Okay, before you go, 5 quick questions. What does success mean to you, Kathleen?
Oh, I had these questions and I didn't prepare for them either. Okay. Success to me, personally,
Mm-hmm.
I want to leave a legacy. And that is a changed community. And that sounds
No,
huge,
I love that.
But that's a legacy that I want to leave. And I don't care if it's not attached to my name. I just want the growth to be there. And so that's, to me, that's success. And I won't achieve it until I'm gone. So, it's.
That's one of the most powerful responses I've had to that question. So what does happiness mean to you?
Fulfillment. Absolutely feeling like no matter how exhausted I am, and I've had these days where I'm sick or I just don't want to go to work or I'm over it or someone's annoyed me or whatever, and then something happens or I get a text message and I bounce out of bed and I'm getting ready and I'm going to work, because that feeling of fulfillment, and I'm not wasting my time at all. Well, sometimes I do. Netflix can do that to you, but that's happiness to me. And the other form of happiness is, of course, my kids when they drive me absolutely bonkers and laughing about ridiculous things, or we just throw all the rules out the window and it's 11 o'clock at night and we're talking rubbish, all sleeping in the same bed together and carrying on, So all of that makes me happy.
That's beautiful. A book that you would recommend someone to read?
I'm a big reader. I read a lot of books. Absolutely love it when I've got the time. Actually, if I was to recommend any book, it's the first book that I ever read that started me loving reading. I was about 5 years old, and it was called The Treasure Hunters by Enid Blyton.
Okay.
And the story in that, it was filled with excitement. They found a map at their grandparents' place, so they needed to find this treasure, but there was a bad guy that was going to find it first. That book is what opened up my imagination. I could picture every word as if the story was playing out in front of me, and that book is what made me love reading.
I love that insight. Yeah, that's so good. 4 people you'd invite to dinner that are either alive or have previously passed, but not friends or family.
I would love to talk with Caroline Chisholm, one of my heroes, absolute idol. For obvious reasons, she made a huge difference in Australia and in the UK as well, supported the migration of a lot of people into this country and was a staunch advocate for women and children who were not independent or were being harmed. And she did that not just at a grassroots level, but actually informed policy. And it was just amazing, amazing woman. Carl Kohlberg, he was a philosopher that developmental lifespan theory, moral development for children. I'm really fascinated in his work. And then probably someone fun like Ryan Reynolds. Yeah.
Perfect. And then finally, a guest that you think we should have on the show?
Now I did think about this one. So I think there's 2 people, and I'm not sure if one of them would even be able to, and I'm not sure if the other one would want to, but my recommendation locally would be Todd Whittaker. He is known as the funny guy, and he's known from XFM. Yes.
Yes. I've met Todd.
Yeah.
He's brilliant.
He is absolutely amazing, but he's known as that funny guy, and he's kind of that comic relief. He's one of the deepest men I've ever spoken with, and he's got the biggest heart, and I think if he was open to sharing, that he would be an amazing person to have in here. And the other person that I would suggest, but I don't even know if it's possible, would be Brittany Higgins. What a great conversation that would be, just to talk about such a horrendous thing becoming so public and having the entire nation judge you, whether it's for or against. That's a incredible journey to go through. So that would be my recommendation.
Great answers. Kathleen, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
That was another episode of the Success Times Happiness podcast. Domestic violence is a serious issue. And if you know of anyone who's impacted by that, feel free to share the show with them. It could really mean a lot. Until next time, peace.